So, and also in some cases, the direct election of suspected criminals. In Iguala, Guerrero, which is where the attacks against the Ayotzinapa students take place, José Luis Abarca, the mayor, and his wife, Maria de los Angeles Pineda, were known cartel operators before they reached office. That is to say that the government or the authorities permitted these individuals to be elected. They're dissident members of the PRD, because the PRD, like the PRI, has many wings with varying levels of complicity with the criminals or with varying levels of impunity. So they were dissident grassroots PRD activists and members in Iguala who tried to raise the flag with federal authorities and say, José Luis Abarca is close to Guerreros Unidos, one of the drug gangs that emerged from the split with the Beltrán Leiva cartel. And they ignored these claims. They ignored them completely. They permitted this guy to reach office. And now he of course, was arrested some months after the Ayotzinapa disappearances, him and his wife. And they're now charged with killing one of these grassroots activists within the PRD. The guys at the grassroots level who are trying to maintain some of the fundamental ideas and behind the party and how the party emerged after the 1988 election with Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. We've seen, as you said, Christy, it was important to point out that people are resisting. Mexicanos do not sit back and let this happen. Many of them get up, go out, let their resistance known in the forms of these movements that have emerged. The Yo Soy 132 movement was key. There's actually a guy on my office who's in one of the guys holding his ID card in that video. We know a lot of these guys that have emerged from that movement. There was also the Peace and Justice movement with Javier Sicilia in 2011, a poet who his son was killed in a bar shooting. The government called all those victims, as they always do, criminals. And this man said, well, that is an offense to the memory of my son and the offense to our name and to our family. And he wrote a public letter, a very moving public letter to President Calderón, at the time, saying, estamos hasta la madre. We've had it up to here, and this isn't working. This method of suppression and of violence and of militarization against the cartels is not working, and our children are dying. Javier Sicilia started this movement. A month later, Felipe Calderón met with Sicilia and other leaders, other prominent human rights leaders, victims of the drug war, in the Castillo de Chapultepec, the Chapultepec Castle, in Mexico City, calling for an end to the conflict, calling for the retreat of the soldiers, to call them back to the bases and to stop the militarization and the implementation of this militarization. That, of course, did not happen. Calderón made a very sort of weak apology, but nothing really changed. Then, the visit by Peña Nieto to Ibero, which was a fantastic moment in which the sons of privilege, the sons and daughters of privilege, because Ibero is an extremely wealthy private school, got up and just said, no, we don't want the PRI to return. Peña Nieto is this bot who is sort of this, he's kind of this avatar of like polished niceness, and we kind of all saw behind him that there were some powerful forces who were seeking to return to power and return to this hegemonic state of the PRI over the country. That movement spread. It was an incredibly powerful movement that I was able to cover on the streets and in the protests. Hundreds of thousands of people really seeing no other recourse but to just at least go out and make their presence known together. And I remember this one particular image of a woman who looked like she just wrote a sign at her house before stepping outside and saying, mothers, please teach your children history so that we don't repeat the same mistakes of generations past. But Peña Nieto won the election anyway. Andrés Manuel López Obrador ran again in what is, you could argue over the merits of that decision. The PRD fractured ever further. Andrés Manuel left the PRD, eventually, and now has formed his own party, and he's running a bunch of candidates, and he's expected to run again in 2018. And he's a very polarizing figure, even for the left, because Andres Manuel is determined to be president, even though in these two past elections, his share of the vote has been declining. So the protest movement was interesting because it was all forms of people manifesting their direct resistance, but Peña won anyway. He said during the campaign he would make adjustments in Calderón's drug war. That also didn't happen. Peña Nieto has kept receiving U.S. aid, kept the military on the streets, and he's kept supporting security agencies that kill unarmed or innocent civilians, as we saw in Ayotzinapa. But I wanted to address kind of another aspect of this, and you could help me historicize this better, because the drug cartels in some ways also offer a form of resistance to the state, or the dissident cartels, I would say, when you think about the way that they present themselves to the public. So let's say you have a government in Mexico City, the centralized Mexican government, far from where you're at in Michoacán or in Jalisco. And a cartel comes and tells you, we are going to protect you. We are going to prevent the other bad guys from coming in and hurting you and your family. We're going to prevent them from extorting you. So they present themselves as these Robin Hood figures. They say the government is corrupt. Don't trust them. Trust us. That has, I think, created the infection of a narco mentality down to the popular level, down to the basic communities, the rural communities that have been ravaged by the effects of NAFTA and by the effects of the neoliberalization. And it was really interesting to see the effects of this. In 2010, they supposedly shot and killed Nazario El Más Loco Moreno in Apatzingán. He was the leader of the Familia Michoacana. It turns out he wasn't killed in that incident. He was killed actually twice in 2014. He was killed for good in 2014. But when he was supposedly killed in 2010, people went out and protested in his memory. And people went out and said, you will always live in our hearts. Nazario Moreno, thank you for protecting us. And people were mourning and celebrating his life. And that was obviously an incredibly discouraging sign for anyone who thinks that the cartel shouldn't have this kind of power, because that demonstrated that the way that the cartels really do convince people far from the halls of power in Mexico City to rely on them and to believe in them and to trust in them. So that was a very sad development of the drug war, the way the narco culture infected so many people's brains, the way narco corridos became a form of popular culture that everyone still listens to and dances to and sings along to in Mexico. And the way that, there have been studies shown in Ciudad Juarez where kids aspire to be cartel members now because of the depth of the way that the cartels have affected local communities. That led in 2013 to the rise of the autodefensa movement, self-defense groups. These are civilians who say, we're going to get together, we're forming militias in the classic definition of the word, and protect our own communities. The first of these emerged again in Michoacán, in Cherán, in La Ruana, in Buenavista, a bunch of other communities. Some of these figures you may have heard of before: Dr. Mireles, a pediatrician who also in the afternoons goes out with his long arm and protects his community. Hipólito, until he was arrested. Hipólito Mora as well. A bunch of other figures who became regular men and women who took up arms to defend themselves. The problem is these autodefensa groups have also not been immune to the influence of cartels. So little by little, they also become influenced and infected by the cartels. So when you have that situation, really you feel like people have nowhere to turn. I think that has led to another form of resistance that I wanted to offer, and I think that's been the resistance with information. As the cartels implement a code of silence on local media, Mexico is now one of the most dangerous countries in the world to practice journalism at the local level. It's more dangerous now I think it's like Turkey and Mexico are like 140 and 141 out of 160 countries that are polled by the organization Reporters Without Borders in terms of press freedom. It's very troubling, of course, because not only for the news producers and the news makers, but for the news consumers who have no way of finding out what is going on in their communities except by turning now to social media and to community news sources that have emerged in this void of trustworthy information. So the cartels implement their code of silence or publish what we want you to publish. That's how they control the media. With the local politicians, it's plata o plomo. It's lead or money. So in that void, some really interesting news outlets have emerged, such as Barrio Antiguo in Monterrey, Rio Doce in Sinaloa, and other outlets that really transmit all of the gory pictures that the press won't give you anymore, like El Blog del Narco, Borderland Beat, and some Twitter users and other groups such as Valor por Michoacán, Valor por Tamaulipas, and now Valor por Jalisco, I think, has also grown. But there are some questions and doubts about the backings of these organizations as well. So it's kind of like there's nowhere to turn. You're always going to be kind of one step away from organized crime in Mexico, and that is a direct effect of this campaign of militarization against organized crime and of Mexico declaring war on itself and inflicting violence on itself in the interest, we're told, of national security in the Mexican state. That leads us now, I think, to Mexico, and I think it's worth acknowledging now that Mexico, the United States, bears enormous responsibility for this crisis. And the question that I think is in a lot of our minds at this point is, why doesn't the United States take more responsibility, and why doesn't the United States acknowledge its role both as drug consumer, as the largest consumer drug market in the world, but also as a role as a supplier of weaponry to Mexico for this conflict and to the cartels for this conflict. The Fast and Furious, they call it a failed gun program in U.S. media, including at the LA Times. When I was covering it for the LA Times, we had to refer to it as this failed gun program. Well, it wasn't very failed. It was actually quite successful. What it was all about was sending guns to the cartels in order to fuel intra-cartel violence, and in order to trace those guns eventually, they said, to top cartel bosses. The consequences of this, of course, were horrific. Who knows how many civilians were killed by these weapons that were supplied by the U.S. government. And I just remember being so appalled by the method that the U.S. was using through the Department of Justice and the FBI and the DEA and the CIA to fuel the violence. It was just like direct fueling of the violence that was affecting so many civilians. In the meantime, the U.S. State Department says nothing about this conflict, literally nothing. Every day I check the State Department daily press briefing, in which reporters from around the world who cover the State Department have the opportunity to ask a spokesperson about any issue in the world. Very rarely is Mexico brought up. The United States is focused, of course, on the Middle East, on the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, on admonishing Venezuela. Maybe every now and then they'll say something about Colombia, now Cuba. But really, there's nothing ever said about Mexico. Nothing said by Hillary Clinton, nothing said by John Kerry. Pat on the back from Barack Obama, just as they were getting pats on the back from George W. Bush. The current U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Anthony Wayne, again says nothing. And the Carlos Pascual, the last ambassador, made a few kind of ruffled feathers in a few instances, and he was fired at the behest of Felipe Calderón, who did not want the U.S. envoy in Mexico to criticize his campaign in any way. So the U.S. has been complicit and has been present kind of since the first step in promoting this state of violence and this state of impunity that Mexico is living right now, and supporting the status quo, basically. So I wanted to address just a couple of more themes along that idea. Besides the military aid, the role of the U.S. I think also manifests itself in the effects of NAFTA, as Christy discussed, and in the way the femicides in Ciudad Juarez, as well as a function of the maquiladora industry, as an after effect of the implementation of NAFTA. The subsidized corn from the United States, which I think is cosmic tragedy that Mexico is importing genetically modified, in many cases, corn from the United States, backed by transnational agribusiness. It's just a lot of doom and gloom that we are dealing with south of the border. But I wanted to address some opportunities also that exist. And I think that one of those is, two. Ever since NAFTA and the rise of the internet, Mexican use of cell phones skyrocketed in the past 10, 15 years. The internet has gone up. Not all Mexican nationals have access to it. I think only about 30% still. So it's a country that is still largely reliant on television, and citizens are mostly reliant on television and the PRI mouthpiece, which is Televisa, which is this monolithic news channel. Think of it like Fox News and CNN put together in one, and controlling 98% of the television market. So you can imagine the lack of information and the lack of true critical journalism that exists in the country. The internet is, I think, little by little changing that, or at least affording people the chance to get other sources of information. And I think the other way is, on a more nebulous side, the idea of culture. There is more transnational migration between Mexico and the United States. More than 1 million U.S. citizens live in Mexico. Hundreds of thousands of Canadian citizens, French citizens, British citizens, hundreds of thousands of people from other countries in South America. Mexico, and in particular Mexico City, is becoming a very cosmopolitan place because of the kinds of opportunities that people are able to carve out for themselves. There are good sides and bad sides to all this movement and this cultural transaction and the transmigration that exists in the country. One of the bad sides, of course, is the advent of U.S.-style consumerism. Mexico was not a country that was used to building its daily life around consuming the way that the United States has become in many ways. It's a culture that is built primarily around the family and around the community. Now there are more malls. There are more people wearing activewear. There are more people who are interested in the latest personal gadgets. It's a country that is kind of feeling culturally more like the United States and becoming a population in which people want to every now and then go to a Denny's or a Sizzler or a Chili's, as opposed to the kinds of culinary practices that Mexico has employed and generated for thousands of years. The cultivation of corn in Mexico is 8,000 years old. So this is a change that is happening that is sad in a lot of ways, but I think hopeful in other aspects of American culture that are also moving south of the border. And I would argue that some of that is stuff that we might take for granted here. We don't regard our public officials, for the most part, as corrupt, although there's a lot of corruption in the United States, but not at the levels that we know of in Mexico. So the more you have migrants who return to Mexico and remember going to, let's say the DMV and getting a driver's license, or let's say going to a hospital or whatever, and being treated maybe not super quickly, but not being allowed to give birth outside of a hospital, as has happened sometimes with indigenous women in Chiapas and in Oaxaca. I think that the more aspects of American culture, such as efficiency and accountability and the prevention of corrupt practices, more people on the Mexican side will demand that as well. And the more that Mexican nationals go back and forth, the more that the cultures, I think, are merging and will merge for good or for ill. And I think that is one of the ways that we can improve the situation in Mexico. Apply more accountability, apply more of the positive or beneficial aspects of the onslaught of U.S. culture and U.S. media. But of course, there are still so many places in which Mexico must improve. And I go back to this question: why don't we say anything? And why is it that Mexico is allowed to fail its people so much? Why is it okay for the United States? Who benefits? The basic question. I think the United States ultimately does benefit from an unstable Mexico. It gets a poor labor market. It gets a poor market of citizens, not citizens, of course, but disenfranchised laborers who come to the United States, contribute to the economy, prop up the economy, permit certain sectors, such as the construction sector, the service sector in the United States to not fall apart. Without getting any of the benefits of citizenship or any of the basic rights that you and I are afforded and consider normal. So that's one of the things that I think we're looking at. And also I think we're just looking at a disdain and a racism for the indigenous and mestizo sides of the country. We're okay with Mexico being poor and being subjugated to some of these practices by the Mexican government, because it's like, oh, well, those Mexicans, we need to focus on the countries that matter to us, our allies, and our conflicts and our confrontations with other world powers. Despite all that, and this is something that still confuses and confounds my thinking, there's just something incredible about Mexico's resilience. And despite the parade of these horrors and the insecurity, Mexico's population still happens to be one of the happiest in the world. It's this crazy contradiction. There was just two reports that came out, the 2015 World Happiness Report by the United Nations says that Mexico is the 14th happiest in the country, happier by a hair than the United States, which is 15th. And also the Happy Planet Index says Mexico is the 22nd happiest country in the world, also higher than the United States. I try to think about that moment, when a stranger stops a Mexicano on the street and asks them, if they are happy. It's the same moment that makes me believe that polls in Mexico are probably fundamentally unreliable. And why? Because I think in Mexican culture, it is considered impolite to respond to a question from a stranger with a negative answer. So in Mexico, basically, people prefer to say a falsehood to you than to give you a negative answer. If you ask a Mexicano, where can I find this address? A Mexicano will prefer to tell you a wrong direction as opposed to say, I don't know. And I think that is what affects these polls. But call me crazy, but I think that's what affects these polls. If a stranger calls the señora who's at home, maintaining her household with her family somewhere in a small city in Mexico, a stranger calls you and asks you how happy you are, well, of course you're going to say, I am just thrilled with life right now and love it, even if that family might have a direct drug war victim in their midst. So I'll leave it at that. But I would also like to add that I'm pretty happy in Mexico, despite having to cover all of this. And I would say that a lot of people who are in Mexico are also happy too. I mean, Mexico is a wonderful place, and I never try to discourage anyone from visiting or from seeing Mexico. And although if you follow me on Twitter or on social media, I am only, in many cases, usually giving you a string of bad news. I am still enjoying my chilaquiles and my coffee in the morning and enjoying saying good morning to the first person you see in the morning, you must say good morning to, no matter who he or she is. Yeah. And every single exchange begins with a good afternoon or a good evening. And these aspects of Mexico's culture keeps us in many ways together and keeps us hopeful for the future and keeps us looking forward to some outlet and to some way in which we can help guide the country to a better place, because it is a country that is so rich and so vibrant and so jubilant in many ways that this nightmare that we've lived for the past 9 years and that we will always remember as the worst nightmare that has happened in North America in many, many decades will be over at some point or will be over soon or could be over. And so I think that is where we are now. We are in this place where it really can't get any lower. And despite that, there is this resilience and there is this sense that Mexico is a country that we love and that we will continue rooting for despite all this horrific tragedy. But I think that also puts us in a dangerous position, because we can't be hopeful and cheer on Mexico in the way that the White House and Los Pinos and Peña Nieto want us to. It is not about spreading propaganda. It is not about denying or negating or ignoring the horrible tragedy that the country has lived and the daily tragedies. But at the same time, we can't ignore or deny all of the wonderful things that people are doing and people are doing for one another against all of these horrible threats. And I'm not just talking about the journalists, the local journalists who are out there risking their lives, but the human rights workers, the social workers, and the leaders and the indigenous leaders who every day are, despite the threats and the great risks that exist for their work, doing their little part and their little job in order to prevent this nightmare from spreading.
Thanks so much.
So thank you.